Shalosio Yatzarel. It's your brother, your cousin, your nephew, young Aniyun Wiya, reporting live on behalf of the master of breath. Hisakir Messi. Aye, I share, aye. To complete your awakening and to let you know that despite what they told you, your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness and your law is the truth, not theirs. And the reason I'm on this live stream tonight, guys, the whole reason I'm on this live stream tonight is actually to help you build the argument that you need. I'm trying to help you build the argument that you need against all those who try to refute the indigeneity of the Negro. When you try to go up against people, there are certain points you need to go to just right off the bat. All right? And it's important. I'm not just doing this to help you argue with your uncle. I'm not just doing this to help you argue with your, Afrocentric cousin, that auntie who's talking about moving to Ghana. That this ain't just about grandma and them, big mama and them. This ain't about family and friends. I am not trying to give you fodder for the family barbecue, the reunion, none of that. That is not the purpose of this. Please understand that. That is not the purpose of this. The reason I'm trying to help you build this argument is because it is actually necessary for us to engage in this exercise, because we're going to need to present this argument, whether you believe so or not, to lawmakers, politicians, congressmen and women, representatives in the House and senators. We're going to have to present this argument to those people eventually, which, by the way, is what Unahia is doing. And you don't need to be politically savvy to help Unahia do what they're trying to do. You should be joining Unahia and helping them do what they do, because they are the ones who are fighting to earn federal recognition of the indigeneity of the Negro. Are you hearing me? Are you understanding the gravity of what I'm saying to you? How can not enough time or a fear of not being able to contribute enough be a good enough reason to not support that? I don't understand. I don't understand. So the issue is we're going to have to present an argument. All right? And we all actually need to pitch in with all the facts that we know, to pull those facts together, complete with their sources. You have to know where your facts come from. There's no one who's going to listen to us unless we can point to something and say, here's how you know that what we're saying is true. We have to be able to point to source material that demonstrates what we're talking about. You understand? It's important. It's important that we're able to do that. Facts and their respective sources must be gathered. And if you're somebody who watches a lot of content creators like myself talking about all these different ways that we can know that the Negro is indigenous to this land, all that content you watch, all those videos you watch, by now you have a lot of information. So you should be able to join and contribute, be a part of the discussions that are going on. Those discussions are not going to remain just Discussions. We're going to advance from discussion to action. And I am personally proud to be a part of that. Got something in my eye. Excuse me for a second. But I'm proud to be a part of that. And those of you who have already joined, you should be proud to be a part of that. I'm proud, to see that. I'm proud to see that. And it's dope. It really is. I just think that everybody needs to get on it. But that's the reason for this stream, is because I am very much aware, as a political journalist, I am very much aware of how these things work. You have to understand Robert's rules. You have to understand the rules that Senate hearings follow, the rules that all congressional hearings, I should say, follow. All right, you got to be aware of those things. If you're aware of those things, let me back up. You don't need to be aware, but I am, and those are the kinds of contributions I bring to the table. But what I'm talking about on this stream, golly, those are the kinds of contributions I bring to the table. But what I'm talking about on this stream is genuinely another critical contribution I bring to the table, which is an organized argument. I believe that the ancestors are trusting several of us, and myself included, to organize the argument. And so that's what I've been doing. Rhetoric is a science. It is the science of argument. And we have to have our ducks in a row when we present our information to the powers that be. And I know many of you are thinking, well, it doesn't matter what we say to them because it's not actually necessary for us to say anything to them. They're not going to, there's no point, because they're trying to hide our identity from us anyway. They're never going to admit who we are. They're never going to just allow us to identify as Indians. They're never going to embrace that. They're never going to affirm that. They're never going to allow that to become mainstream after all the work they've done to hide it. They have not been hiding it. We're going to squash that tonight, okay? And all my content is this is the reason why I use mainstream sources. This is the reason why I use mainstream sources for everything I talk about. So what you're going to see is, and I'm going to come back to that point in a minute, but what you're about to see, what I'm about to do, I'm about to play some clips. The clips I'm going to show you, I'm about to play several clips. And all these clips I'm about to show you come from past videos that I've done. And the reason why is because I'm just taking these little excerpts out of my videos so that I can show you how I've been organizing the argument. If you've been watching my content, or if you're new to the channel, welcome. Please go back and watch the other videos, because the purpose of all these videos, each video is a puzzle piece. Each presentation is a puzzle piece. The puzzle is one gigantic argument intended to prove who we are. And half of that identity is American Indian. Why do I say half? Because that is the half that is nearest us in history. That is who we are today, in the present. And in the ancient past, we are the Yatsarali. In the ancient past, we are the Yatsarali. Right? So, this is what I'm trying to demonstrate to you guys. I'm trying to show you that there's an argument to be made for all of this that can be organized and demonstrated using only mainstream sources. Two of the videos that these clips come from, two of the videos that I've taken clips from to go over tonight are videos that have the words mainstream evidence or mainstream proof in the title, because I'm trying to drive home to you guys the fact that I use mainstream sources. That's what I do. I'm the mainstream source guy. Okay? That's what I'm all about. A lot of the content creators in this niche are not using mainstream sources, and they may have found some very interesting things worth sharing, but because the sources of that information are not mainstream, we're the only ones willing to believe what we find in those sources, and the people we're arguing against can dismiss those sources in many cases, case-by-case basis. But I am trying to present non-dismissible source material. So, all that being said, I want to show you guys some things, all right? I'm going to show you guys some things. Basically, at least for this live stream, because this is not going to be the last time that I do this. I will do more of this in the future. In this live stream, I'm trying to show you guys the argument as it pertains to slave demography and miscegenation, because those are two cornerstones of the argument. If you can at least get these things down, that's game already. Now, is there a lot more to it than these things that we're going to talk about tonight? Of course. I mean, this rabbit hole is a bottomless pit. The rabbit hole of black people in America actually being the indigenous people of America is a bottomless pit. There's no end in sight to how much digging there is to go to unearth more and more information that supports this and complicates it. But that's not my point. That's not my point. Right now, I am giving you two cornerstones of the argument, dealing with slave demography and miscegenation. All right? Just to give you guys an idea of which videos this is coming from, let me identify those videos for you real quick. I'm gonna show you. I'm gonna show you a quick reel, and you'll get an idea. And if you've seen those videos, you'll recognize these little clips, and you'll be like, oh, okay. You know what I'm saying? And it'll just give you an idea of where we're going with this. And even if you haven't seen it, I think it'll still clue you into where we're going with this in the discussion tonight. Check this out real quick.
But most of us don't know that history well enough to realize that Black Americans are indigenous. Mainstream sources provide us with mathematical evidence that the same population we now call African Americans is the population we used to call Indians. African slaves were genuinely brought here. It's just that their numbers were much smaller than those of the indigenous populations with whom they mixed. This is arguably the most mainstream data source you can possibly find for information on the transatlantic slave trade. Period. If the white man was trying to trick you into believing you came from Africa, don't you think it would behoove them to add a 0 to this figure? Maybe even 2? The original phenotype, dark skin, with strong curly hair, and a few Sephardic Jews here and there. The social status of being biracial became massive in each tribe. We're headed into the National Archives just to read the annotation for the microfilmed records pertaining to early censuses. You have to know where to look for the evidence of it happening. Taking a look at one of those microfilms from the National Archives, we can see how race was counted for Carroll County, Georgia. This book is saying that the vast majority of slaves in Georgia did not get brought in from other states. I showed you how the Cherokee half-breeds became the leadership of the tribe, sold out neighboring tribes, because that's what a reservation is. It's a tract of land specifically allotted for people who are mixed with both indigenous and European ancestry. It's just a way to consolidate mixed Indians and thereby free up larger corridors of real estate for Euro-American settlers. It was entitled, quote, Half-breeds, Squatters, and Land Speculators, the Struggle Over the Half-Breed Tract in Southeast Iowa.
Okay, so check this out, Regardless of whether you recognized that content or not, we're about to dive into that content. Each of the videos so those clips came from 3 of my past videos. And of those 3 presentations, I've taken several clips each. There's a lot of meat left on those bones, though, that in terms of the exposition that I used in each presentation to explain the significance of the things that we're going to be talking about in a broader context. So I strongly encourage you to go watch those videos for yourself so you can see how this information fits into the broader narrative, right? There's a broader narrative on each one than what I'm trying to cover tonight, because obviously it took significantly more time to unpack each of those topics individually in those presentations, and that's for a reason. But whatever. Right now, what I'm trying to do is just get you to see these concepts that I think are most critical from those presentations. So one of those things, I said slave demography. The math is what is most interesting about this. So when we're talking about demography, we're talking about demographics. The demographics of the enslaved population, but not just the enslaved population. The demographics of the people who today are considered to be the descendants of slaves. Now, the reason why it's so interesting is because when we do the math, we're looking at the 1860 census, and we're looking at the slave voyages database. And I've seen some people take issue with the slave voyages database, and including Curry Mail, and yet Curry Mail used the slave voyages database itself to discredit it. But in the process of doing so, his argument also accepted several of the statistics that it gave him as being true, in order to make further points about these certain statistics not being true. And you can't play that game. It's either legit or it's not. All right, don't be wishy-washy about that. Now, if you genuinely don't believe, if for some reason you feel it is your opinion that it's just not legit, I don't have anything against you for that. If that's how you feel, that's how you feel. But just understand, this is a mainstream source, and the information that it has actually helps your argument. So you shouldn't be trying to discredit the slave voyages database when it helps your argument. So I don't know why you would do that. I think a lot of people just really want to see that number of African slaves go all the way down to 0, and obviously the slave voyages database is not reporting that, so that makes you uncomfortable, and then you take issue with this. You believe this whole thing is an entire conspiracy theory. You have an entire conspiracy. You believe this whole thing is a conspiracy, and we'll get to that. I'm gonna bring that back up in a minute to address it. But the point is, stats from the Slave Voyages database, stats from the census, and also the birth rate of the colored population in America throughout slavery. All of those things need to be subjected to mathematical analysis, and it's not complicated math, by the way. It's not complicated math. Not the math we're doing. Demographers have already done the hard math for us, and we can take their information and run with it. It helps our argument. So, so that's why I did the presentations that I did, and you should go back and check those out. The other thing we're covering is mixed Indians, mixed Indian removal in particular, because it needs to be understood that that Indian removal is not something that happened to us very much. Yes, we were included in it to a small degree, but the majority of our people, when I say our people, let me not phrase it that way, because that's rude. Native Americans are our people. The Native Americans who look white, they are our people, but they're mixed. That's my point, right? And for those of us, and for those of us who, you know, are just classified as quote unquote African American, you know, regardless of the shade of our melanin, of course, but we know Negroid features when we see them, right? We are people who were left behind. We were not removed. We were left behind in the same places that we had been in, and then we were reclassified and recontextualized. So it's important to understand that the mixed Indians are the ones who were removed, not all Indians from their respective territories. In the territories where Indians were removed, the ones who were removed were mixed, and we're going to talk about that. So, let's just dive into some of that. Let's dive into some of that real quick. Let me show you these clips.
Regional disembarkation data shows only an estimated 388,747 slaves from Africa ever landed on mainland North America from 1501 to 1875. Like literally the whole slave trade. If the white man was trying to trick you into believing you came from Africa, don't you think it would behoove them to add a 0 to this figure? Maybe even 2? I mean, it's a conspicuously diminutive stat. It does a terrible job of deceiving the 40+ million black Americans living today that they're Africans. This underwhelming figure falls wildly short of not only the millions that one might expect, but also short of the 1860 census record of 4.4 million colored slaves and free coloreds approaching emancipation. Meanwhile, the Census Bureau is telling you that this is less than 1/10 of how many colored people there were at the time of emancipation. Think about that. There's nothing more mainstream than the government itself. The Census Bureau is a federal government agency. It's part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, which is one of the executive bodies of the U.S. government. So from the top, the government is providing us with the statistical data we need to demonstrate that the black population was suspiciously large in 1860. It took from 1619 to 1860 to even bring the majority of this 388,747 people here. On the 1860 census, it just says colored people, not Negroes or black people. Because of this, the average Native American might say, well, how do you know which colored people were black and which ones were Indians? They called us colored too. That only helps our argument honestly, because if you're suggesting that this colored population actually bifurcates into 2 separate groups, then you admit that a lot of the coloreds were Indians, which is our whole point. Just to be clear though, the people called colored then are the people called African American today. We can look at this 1992 peer-reviewed journal article to prove it if we need to. It was published by Tom Smith through Oxford University Press into an academic journal called The Public Opinion Quarterly. Oxford University Press is arguably the most mainstream publisher in the history of American literature. The title takes it as a given that a single demographic was first called colored, then Negro, then black, and then African American. The colored population has always been only those of very dark complexion and tightly coiled hair. We should not be perpetuating a conspiracy theory that Euro-Americans somehow lied and convinced us that we're from Africa without there ever having been a real transatlantic slave trade. If they were that much smarter than us, then they earned their place as our masters. Only an inferiority complex could believe that the white man literally ran circles around our ancestors like that. No, African slaves were genuinely brought here. It's just that their numbers were much smaller than those of the indigenous populations with whom they mixed. Their numbers were so much smaller that the phenotype of the so-called African American has to be determined primarily by Aboriginal DNA. The African contribution to this gene pool would be minuscule. In a study published in 2020, Dr. J. David Hacker at the University of Minnesota found that slave birth rates in the 19th century were very high, near a biological maximum for a human population. This means that our population grew faster in the 1800s than any human population could be expected to grow based on the stats he and other historians have compiled. He also goes through a litany of other demographic historians who agree with him that the birth rates in these decades are almost impossibly massive. Hacker's study concedes this without even bringing up the fact that males also outnumbered females almost 3-to-1 among African slaves, further impinging upon the African American population's ability to procreate at this nigh unprecedented rate. In other words, who would white men rape to raise the slave numbers this high so fast? What the study does acknowledge is that child-to-woman ratios leapt wildly for the slave population in the Chesapeake region from the 1660s to the 1780s, in ways only explained by a serendipitous confluence of slave fertility increasing and slave child mortality declining simultaneously. Put simply, the slave population boom even before the 1800s could only be possible if slaves miraculously got inhumanly fertile while enslaved babies just never died of anything ever, which is equally miraculous, especially considering they were slaves in a society that didn't value their lives at all. It's worth noting that, until 1700, New England colonies trafficked very few slaves from Africa, but enslaved more and more Indians, shipping many to the West Indies and Europe.
Okay, guys, so check this out. I hope you're seeing kind of the skeletal framework of this argument starting to take shape already when you watch these clips. The 1860 census, this is critical. The 1860 census was actually showing us how, okay, so when you look at how many persons of color there were, both slave and free, the number we care the most about, I mean, we care about both numbers individually, but the number we care most about is the total. When you add them together, the aggregate sum of colored persons, both slave and free, is over 4.4 million people, right? In 1860, that's how they were counting us. Why is it that we're picking 1860? Why do we specifically want to look at that census? We're looking at 1860 because, if you recall, emancipation is something that comes in the 60s. The Civil War comes in the 60s. The abolition of slavery comes in the 60s. So, picking the 1870 census has less impact for our argument. We want to show what was the census reporting going into emancipation while people are, this is the final census of slavery. It's the final census of slavery. So it's the end cap for the institution of slavery, for counting us within the institution of slavery. And of course, a lot of these persons of color, the bigger number in fact, is people who are not enslaved. Free persons of color. Lots of free persons of color, right? So we're looking at this though, and it's 4.4 million in total. That presents a discrepancy because when we look at the slave voyages database, we can clearly see that how many people were actually brought from Africa to mainland North America specifically. 388,747 people exactly. So 300, that number is I mean, that's less than 10% of the number we're seeing in the 1860 census. We do have to, though, account for the fact that this number is expected to multiply into something over a certain amount of time. But also keep in mind, it's 388,747 people over the course of the entire time that slaves were being brought to mainland North America from Africa, which is primarily, yes, technically it goes back to 1619, but honestly, 1619 is nothing. 20 some odd? No. The real traffic from Africa to mainland North America, we're not talking about to South America, we're not talking about to the Caribbean, we're talking about only to mainland North America, was that traffic from Africa to here specifically began in the early 1700s, picked up right in the first decade of the 1700s. By 1720, it had really gotten going, and from there all the way to 1860 is that traffic, right? That's the traffic that we're talking about. And over the course of all that time, it took all that time to bring these 388,747 people. So that means that in the 1700s, a significantly smaller number of slaves from Africa were reproducing. And the reason why that's important is because the birth rate of slaves is what they use to justify how this number grew so fast. And it is posing a scientific problem, because the reason I bring up J. David Hacker in my previous presentations, and you saw his name pop up, is because this is a guy who is a demographic historian, and he's white, and he's an expert in his field. He was interviewed on the subject by USA Today because he is that kind of expert. And that guy who is that kind of expert pulled together an executive summary of all the researchers who have ever researched this topic, and he showed how he agrees with all of them. There is a unanimous consensus among him and all the other experts on this subject about the fact that the slave math ain't mathin', and because what he's saying is that the birth rate of the colored population in this country throughout slavery pushes the biological maximum for what you can ever even expect to have been reported for us. For a population of our size, our birth rate was uncanny. And he's hinting at it might be impossible. It might be biologically impossible for. And all the historians who are experts on this subject, they all agree with this, that it might be biologically impossible for us to be attributing this birth rate to this population size. It just doesn't make sense. It confounds them. He spent considerable text and time in his study, which I went over in the presentation, talking about this ad nauseum. So it's a thing. It's a thing. And that means we should be looking for whether or not there are any alternative explanations for how this population grew to the size that it grew to. Because by 1960, all we know is there's 4.4 million of these people, and it just doesn't make sense how we got there. It just doesn't make sense how we got there. Expert demographers, stats are what they do. Population growth is their expertise. The study of populations, that's what they do. That's what a demographer is. And so that's what they're saying. You understand what I'm saying? That's the whole point. That is what the problem is. Plus, we have to factor in the reclassifications that our people underwent. We underwent significant reclassification. There are other complications to talk about, and you should go check those presentations to see what I'm talking about. But the other thing is reclassification. we did go from Negro to colored to black to African American over the course of all this time to get to the present. Who's to say that we weren't first Indian? Indian, then colored, then Negro, or whatever. Indian, then Negro, then colored, then black, then African American. You see what I'm saying? All of this reclassification, it makes sense that our identity would get lost in the mix. And when I say get lost, because again, I want to emphasize the fact that white people are not hiding this from you. Seriously, white people are not hiding this from you. This information is lost to them too. And you believe it's a conspiracy that they're trying to hide this. Let me tell you something. A lot of y'all want to believe that no Africans were brought here, and that doesn't make sense. We're saying 388,747 African slaves were genuinely brought to mainland North America, and you might actually have some of their blood in your DNA. I don't know why that's a problem for y'all, but you might. It's very possible. It's very possible. Now, what percentage of your DNA they make up is very, very, very debatable and probably varies very widely from one of us to another of us. No telling. But it's something you do need to consider, because honestly, if you believe that these people are deliberately trying to fool you into thinking you're African, they are consciously trying to trick you and make you think you're African when you're actually not African at all. If you think that they're trying to trick you with that, and that it's all just fabricated, then you have to answer this question. Why on earth would the number be 388,747? Why? Why not inflate that number? Why not slap a 0 or 2 on that number? Because I mean, if it's an active conspiracy, how come they're not censoring any of the information we're finding? Again, I keep telling you, I'm using mainstream sources. We're talking about Slave Voyages database and census numbers. The Slave Voyages database is put together by by a bunch of universities and trusted institutions. I mean, I don't even know Harvard was involved. We're talking about. Listen. This is huge, because it's as mainstream as it could possibly be. And the census, that's the government. What are we talking about? All the information we need to build our argument is in plain sight. And you're over here saying, yeah, because they're sly as a fox. Haha. What are you talking about? They would have hidden it if that's what they were doing. If they were hiding things, they would have hidden this. Why hide all of these other suggestive things that don't even solidify our argument anyway? But then fail to hide the most obvious data. As soon as you thought we might be Indians, you know what the first thing should have been that you did? The first thing you should have done was go to the censuses. Look at each census record. Once you found out there was a Slave Voyages database, check that out. These are just obvious things what are you talking about? They're practically building the narrative for us, but they don't realize it. That's the only explanation, is that they don't realize it. And why wouldn't they realize it? Because they genuinely don't know. They forgot just like you forgot. You forgot you was Indian. You don't think they forgot you was Indian? Of course they forgot you were Indian. You stopped identifying as an Indian a long time ago. Check my Harlem Renaissance video to understand that. So that's what I'm saying. It's not a conspiracy. It doesn't make sense for you to even bill it as a conspiracy. We were reclassified over time, and our identity has become increasingly complicated with each decade with each passing decade and with each passing generation, our identity has complexified significantly, but no one's trying to hide our true identity from us. It's in plain sight, and when you research it, you can find the information and prove it. You can prove it. Let me show you these other clips real quick. I just want to show you these other clips. Because I'm just trying to get you to be aware of, what's going on. The other steps you need to take in this argument. When you're making this argument, you're not done yet. There's more that needs to be demonstrated. Let's take a look real quick.
We're headed into the National Archives just to read the annotation for the microfilmed records pertaining to early censuses. Pay attention to what the first couple sentences tell you. Quote, prior to 1900, few Indians are included in the decennial federal census. Indians are not identified in the 1790 to 1840 censuses. In 1860, Indians living in the general population are identified for the first time. End quote. So this is confirmation of the fact that, well, A, Indians weren't being counted on the early censuses. Taking a look at one of those microfilms from the National Archives, we can see how race was counted for Carroll County, Georgia at the time of Indian removal. This microfilm specifically comes from U.S. Gen Web Archives, and the file we're viewing is a copy of census taker Benjamin Merrill's count. This copy belongs to Gen Web genealogist Wally Smith, who provides his own annotation with the file. Reading his annotation, Smith says, quote, the 1830 U.S. Census for Carroll County, Georgia, was the first census for Carroll County. It was enumerated by Benjamin Merrill on the 25th of November, 1830. He shows a total population of 3,419, including 1,430 white males, 1,293 white females, 244 male slaves, 244 females, 111 free-colored males, 27 free-colored females. It appears that the free-colored people counted were mostly Native Americans. This is unusual and provides some rare data about some of our first Americans. They were all listed on the last 2 pages of the record, end quote. In an essay entitled The Use of Racial and Ethnic Terms in America, Management by Manipulation, Forbes explained, quote, the 1800, 1810, 1820, and 1830 United States censuses used the free person of color category for most non-whites, including Indians. Thus, the native families of Robeson County, North Carolina, and all Virginia counties are always classified as colored persons. There were only 3 non-whites to speak of here: Africans, Indians, and a few Sephardic Jews here and there. There were occasionally European Moors entering the country and adding to this demographic also, but they came in negligibly small numbers. So Forbes is confirming for us that Indians were being classed as colored during the Indian removal era, and he even gave us a lot more counties as examples of places where this can be observed. I pointed out the Georgia example, though, because it relates directly to my own people, but also because it demonstrates that this wasn't just an East Coast thing. Also, don't forget, Jack D. Forbes is the foremost pundit on all things pertaining to Native American history, and he himself was Native American. That's why citing his indefatigably prolific works on the subject hold a lot of weight here. Also notice that Wally Smith, the genealogist that wrote the annotation on that microfilm, said it was unusual for Indians to get classified as persons of color. Jack D. Forbes flat out disagrees with Wally on that. Forbes is basically saying it happened pretty often, but you have to know where to look for the evidence of it happening, because we don't often have observable proof in every county or state anymore. Wally only said that because his perspective is emblematic of the Euro-American confusion on all this today. they've changed how they view color over the years. So today's whites struggle to get into the heads of yesterday's whites when it comes to sizing up the features of colored people. Today, the Census Bureau counts white, black, Native American, and Asian or Pacific Islander as 4 separate races. But notice that the 1860 census mentions the colored race as though there's only one. This perfectly exemplifies the disparity in perspectives I was talking about between white people across different centuries. But it also illustrates that black and Native American were viewed as interconnected. They were considered one colored race because they were really the same people. And since there was no meaningful Asian presence in the population, there was basically just one colored race.
That's another thing. No Indians till 1860. No Indians till the 1860 census. So before the 1860 census, indigenous people were not counted toward general population. Why? What does that mean? What we're talking about is the reason why they weren't being counted toward general population is because they were part of sovereign nations, and the sovereignty of those nations therefore would withhold their populations from the United States population. It's the same the reason they weren't being counted toward the general population of the United States is the same reason why Mexicans were not being counted toward the general population of the United States. They were in Mexico, and Indians were in Indian territory, and Canadians were in Canada. None of those people were being counted toward the general population of the United States. Why would they be? They're not in the United States. Indian territory is not the United States. It's Indian territory. That's how they saw it back then. That began to change over time, and the first step was getting to the point where Indians were being counted toward the general population of each individual state. So that began in 1860. The same census where we see this massive number of free persons of color. And of course, Native Americans make up an incredibly diminutive proportion of the population today. And we as quote unquote African Americans are several times larger than they are on paper. Again, it's not hidden. You just go straight to the Census Bureau and you can see that the Native American population is incredibly small. And the quote unquote African American population is frankly huge. It's huge. It's huge. So you look at that, and then check this out. I showed you guys a microfilm. I showed you guys some data from a microfilm that demonstrated that there were free coloreds, people listed as free persons of color, free coloreds in Carroll County, Georgia. Now, when I showed you Carroll County, Georgia, free persons of color, those free persons of color turned out to be Indians, and that was what was remarkable to the person who created that who created that microfilm, who put that data there. He puts that data there, and the reason he's so interested is because he's like, wow, they're called persons of color, but it turns out they're Native American. That's the term he used, Native American, right? But what are we talking about? What is he talking about? Of course they were persons of color. He has forgotten by the time he's alive. This is all history already. And so he's looking back at this, and he makes the microfilm, and he writes on there that this is incredible. This is weird. This is crazy. It's not crazy. What are you talking? It's not crazy. But you are not used to thinking of Native Americans as persons of color, because colored people is a term that everyone just associates straight up with African Americans, quote unquote African Americans. When you think colored people, That term, you immediately hear that and think African Americans. Immediately. And it has been only very gradually that people have started to use the term persons of color to include anyone besides us. It was only us. Now they're trying to include, like, Latinos and stuff, which is funny because the Latinos in the United States are predominantly white people. Yeah, I understand you're Hispanic, but you're white Hispanic, so I don't even know why we're talking about the black and brown community. There's no black and brown community. There's just my black community. I don't know what you're doing here. In the words of Walter White from Breaking Bad, there is no your half. There is only my all of it. You know what I'm saying? That's all there is to it. You're not part of this. You're not part of... You're marginalized how? You know what I'm saying? The black and brown community. You're brown how? Very few of the brown ones are in their countries. Brown Mexicans are in Mexico. Brown Guatemalans are in Guatemala. Brown Hondurans are in Honduras. Seriously, I'm not trying to be funny. Brown Venezuelans, frankly, there are no brown Venezuelans. There are no brown Venezuelans, not here in the United States and not in Venezuela. There's none. I don't even know what we're talking about. They've gotten rid of all theirs. Porque en su país los morenos son basura. What did I say? I said in their country, the brown people are trash. And maybe not so much today, because again, they've gotten rid of them all. But the reason they got rid of them all is because that's how they have historically thought. That's been their mindset. And they brought in, they invited miscegenation, what they call blanqueamiento. Blanqueamiento is this phenomenon that, will be covered in future presentations. I imagine a good amount of you have probably heard of it and you understand to some extent what it is. But there's a lot that needs to be studied about it. My point is, free persons of color, I bring up Jack D. Forbes to show you Carroll County, Georgia is not just an outlier. The guy who made that microfilm makes it sound like this is weird that Native Americans were being referred to as persons of color. It wasn't weird. It's because the Indians the Indians they're talking about, you're just seeing names and numbers. You're not seeing the people because you didn't live in their time. But they were persons of color. They were colored people. They had color in them. And they had, I'm sure, a very wide range of shades. Some very dark and some very light, but they were clearly brown people. Dark what? Light what? Light brown. Dark brown. These were people whose brownness was still very obvious and easy to see. And that's why they were called people of color. If they could pass, then census takers would not have marked them as persons of color. You understand? So, that's my point. Jack D. Forbes makes that point. Not only that, Jack D. Forbes points out that Jack D. Forbes, the way he discusses it. Did you pay attention? Go back and look at the frame that I showed you. When I showed you a picture of what it said in his book, you can see he's talking about these are free persons of color, Indians, free persons of color, right? And his syntax suggests there's only one colored race anyway. When you go look at the 1860 census, go back and look at that. I put it on the screen in that presentation. When you go look at that 1860 census, did you ever notice that it said at the top, in that top paragraph, at the end of that top paragraph, it said, the colored race, as though there's only one. Now, they don't mean in the whole world. They just mean in their country, in the population that we're counting. In the population we're counting, we have a colored population. One colored population. And we are going to take stock of the colored race with the following chart, where we show you the numbers. Here's the colored race. That's all there is. There's only one colored race. There's only one. There are not two colored races here. And there's two reasons that's significant. One, because, and I know some of y'all are going to take it the wrong way and be like, yeah, because there's no Africans. No. It's because the Africans that were brought here and the Indians who were already here were related to each other. They are of the same race, and white people already thought so. Even if you disagree with that, it's important to note that the white colonizer considered the Africans they took to be different from all the other Africans. They considered the African they took, and there have been presentations where I've talked about this. I'll talk about it some more in the future. The Africans that they took, they considered to be foreigners to those African territories, those African lands, those African countries, those African kingdoms, those African tribes. They saw those African people as outsiders among the Africans. Which is why the Zondervan Bible Dictionary then comes along and you know, starts describing all Africans as the descendants of Ham, but then excludes the Negro and says not the Negro though. The Negro's not part of the whole Hamitic thing. Africans, yes, but not the Negro. Like what? Do you not see? And Zondervan Bible Dictionary. That is an American publication. It is an American publication. From a company that I believe is an American publication from a company that I believe has Dutch roots. So, white people, the colonizers, because the Dutch were colonizing too. The white people in general, had it in their minds that Negro is for something that's not specifically African. Black people who are not specifically African. Which is why they labeled the region that they took most of the slaves from Negro land. If Negro, just meaning black, is being used by English speakers to say the black people, why are we designating a specific chunk of Africa as the part of Africa where the black people are? Negro land. No, that's not what they meant. Because they don't speak Spanish, they don't speak Portuguese, they speak English, and they're not being very careful with the use of the word Negro. They don't care about that. They know it means black, but that's but they already have a word for black. It's black. So if they just wanted to mean all black people, they would just say black. But they started using the term Negro and misappropriating it, not misappropriating it, but using it as a label for these people who they considered different from the other black people. Like, we got a lot of black people, but among them are the Negroes. And the Negroes are something specific. Negroes were in Africa and they were in America. See what I'm saying? So these are the things that you have to take into consideration. You have to take into consideration. There was one colored race. The Negro race. In America, in the United States, there was one colored race. Because we are the Indians. And that's who that colored race is. It's predominantly just indigenous people. And then the Africans brought here are really just the same people. as the people who were already here. There is one colored race here. That's what they were saying. Let me show you one more series of clips. I just want to show you a few more clips. I'm gonna come back on the other side and make a quick point, and I'm gonna let y'all go.
In the 21st century, modern Native Americans look like Europeans, or at best, Hispanics. And we tend to think that most of these people live on reservations, but actually a Pew Research analysis reports that only about 25% of recognized Native Americans live on reservations. The United States Department of the Interior, which encompasses the Bureau of Indian Affairs, defines a reservation as, quote, an area of land reserved for a tribe or tribes under treaty or other agreement with the United States, executive order or federal statute or administrative action as permanent tribal homelands, and where the federal government holds title to the land in trust on behalf of the tribe. End quote. Okay. So it's a land trust, which means a legal entity is managing real estate on behalf of its owner. In this case, that property manager is the federal government, and the owner is the tribe. In the old days, any random segment of land would be called a tract. Why does that matter? Because that's the word you need to look for when you're trying to find documentation on some of the earliest reservations. Dr. Matthew Hill is an associate professor of Native American Studies at the University of Iowa. In March of 2018, he delivered a fascinating lecture at a grad school symposium hosted by the University of Northern Iowa. There's no recording or transcript of the lecture available online, but I can show you the title and abstract. It was entitled, quote, Half-breed squatters and land speculators, the struggle over the half-breed tract in southeast Iowa. End quote. Look at the keywords listed for the presentation. It says racially mixed people, and then it says Indian reservations. Why does it say that? Because that's what a reservation is. It's a tract of land specifically allotted for people who are mixed with both indigenous and European ancestry. Quote, in an 1824 treaty with the Sewauken-Meskwaki, the United States created the half-breed tract, an allotment of 119,000 acres between the Des Moines and the Mississippi rivers in southeast Iowa to people with a mixed Indian and French heritage, then called half-breeds. Skip down to Dr. Hill's thesis statement, which is the last sentence. Using court records, treaties, land records, and secondary sources, my project explores the struggle for ownership of the half-breed tract and highlights the significance of mixed-race peoples in treaties between the United States and Indian nations, the role of land speculators and squatters in the battle over Native American land, and the fluidity and confusion surrounding race and identity in 19th century Iowa. End quote. This is where it all began for Indian reservations as we know them today. It's already 1824, so we're past the Louisiana Purchase. These are Indians who descend from the incredibly numerous French settlers who had lived among those tribes to that point. They were actually marrying Indian women so frequently that they created whole clans of mixed Indians, and that's who was put on the reservation. Now, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's archives host an article online about a rural town called Barada, and it includes a thorough account of Barada's history. It introduces the town by saying the following, quote, the only Barada in the world, according to the World Book Atlas, is nestled in the hills of northeast Richardson County on what was the half-breed tract. Under the Fourth Prairie du Chien Treaty, which came in 1830, land was given to the outcast half-breeds, primarily the progeny of Indians and French trappers and traders. End quote. Once again, we see land reserved for mixed Indians with significant European ancestry. Article 9 of the Fourth Prairie du Chien Treaty says, quote, the Sioux bands in council having earnestly solicited that they might have permission to bestow upon the half-breeds of their nation the tract of land within the following limits, to wit, beginning at a place called the Barn, below and near the village of the Red Wing Chief, and running back 15 miles. Thence, in a parallel line with Lake Pepin and the Mississippi, about 32 miles to a point opposite Beef, or Obiff River. Thence, 15 miles to the Grand Encampment opposite the river aforesaid, the United States agree to suffer said half-breeds to occupy said tract of country, they holding by the same title and in the same manner that other Indian titles are held. End quote. The Oto, Yowa, certain Sioux tribes, and others were all part of this, and they felt mixed Indians owed it to their tribes to take this opportunity to claim territory as secure from the colonizer. The paleface, however, saw his mixed offspring as inferior to himself, and thus not subject to the same laws, so they felt mixed Indians needed to live away from whites. Then comes the Nemaha Reservation, whose history we can learn from a book called An Unspeakable Sadness, The Dispossession of the Nebraska Indians. Page 61 demonstrates what we're looking for here. Quote, "This triangular homeland was carved out of southeastern Nebraska and named the Nemaha Half-Breed Reservation, in return for this 138,000-acre cession," end quote. Are you seeing the pattern here? You may recall from my presentation on how Cherokee became white that President Andrew Jackson, quote, habitually spoke of the Cherokee Nation and other southern Indian nations as though they consisted of only two classes of people, those he called the real Indians, and those he called the half-breeds, end quote. I showed you how the Cherokee half-breeds became the leadership of the tribe sold out neighboring tribes by allying with the colonizer and assimilated with Euro-American culture. They're the ones Andrew Jackson dealt with directly, and they're also the ones who were carted off to Oklahoma.
25% of Native Americans live on the res today, and what's funny about that is it's a significant reversal of the proportions we had around the time of 1860. That census we keep focusing on, at that time, yeah, the Indians started being counted toward general population, but almost 100% of quote-unquote Native Americans, who we would call Native Americans today, almost all of those who had been removed to designated Indian territory were staying on their reservations at that time. You know what I'm saying? Like, 1860, if you had been removed, you'd been removed and you were in Indian territory, period, right? And those who would be removed later, same thing. Well into the 90s, Native Americans were not leaving reservations. They were not going and just living amongst other people in cities and stuff. No, they were staying on the reservations. They wasn't moving. They were staying on the reservations. Reservations are land trusts in which the trustee is the tribe and the administrator of that trust is the federal government of the United States. And its purpose originally was to serve as a holding of land, basically a designation of a large swath of land, a tract of land, for mixed Indians, what they call half-breeds. And when they said half-breeds, they weren't being very specific, meaning not literally half, just that you were biracial. They weren't big on the fractions thing yet. So that's for the same reason they was calling you mulatto. Indians were being called mulatto. And it wasn't because they were actually mixed. Jack D. Forbes talks about this. It wasn't because they were mixed. The Indians were just being called mulatto, period. Because the idea was if we determine that you are indigenous, we're going to call you mulatto. And if we do not determine that you're indigenous, we're going to call you Negro. We're going to call you black. Right? I explain why that is in a different presentation. And we'll talk more about that in the future. There were incentives to inflate the numbers of Africans during slavery. But we'll talk about that in another presentation. The point is, because I've already talked, I've covered it. I've covered it a couple of times already. But we'll swing back around to that because it's going to be relevant several more times. But the point point is that these people who were on these tracts of land were biracial. They were mixed. Indigenous, European. That's how reservations were started. That's what reservations come from. Reservations are originally half-breed tracts. And if you go back to the presentation where I covered that, you will see that I actually did a very comprehensive and thorough job of covering it. I gave several examples to demonstrate early reservations being for quote unquote half-breed tracts. Early reservations started as half-breed tracts. That's the beginning of reservations. The history of reservations in this country starts with half-breed tracts. Why? Because Native Americans living on reservations are the descendants of mixed Indians, and they've been mixing out continually ever since, becoming whiter and whiter and whiter ever since. Native Americans happen to be the ethnic group in the leading ethnic group in this country for interracial marriage per capita. You might not have known that. More than anyone else, both in the female category and the male category, Native Americans lead the way by far in interracial marriage. That's because it is their tradition to mix, because they come from only the mixed Indians in the first place. So I'm trying to put y'all on game. This is how you put together the argument to show people Native American. When you try to argue that Native Americans are just Mongolians who came over here from Asia and they're just, they're not even part of it. They snuck in here some type of way and took our place and ooh. You sound crazy, and you cannot back that up. I'm telling you, that's not gonna hold up, because you're playing fast and loose with your sources, and you're not doing a good job of demonstrating it. No, that's because, and the reason you're having to do that is because that is not an explanation that really applies universally. What does apply universally is that across the board, the people being considered Native Americans today descend from people who genuinely were Indians, and they're still considered Indians, but they were the mixed Indians who were separated from us. And so that's the important thing. The reason why we even need to focus on the fact that they are the mixed Indians is because only the mixed Indians were removed. Only the mixed Indians ended up on these reservations. And reservations are for mixed Indians in the first place. So they were taken out of what population? A population of Indians who were not mixed. They were removed for being mixed and put in designated spots, but the ones who were not mixed made up the broader and larger population that they were taken out of. That's us. That's us. So I want you to think about that. The slave math, the demographics, mixed Indians. All right. This is how you put it all together. Slave demography and miscegenation. Miscegenation is marrying into the indigenous population in order to whiten them out, so that there no longer is an Indian after a set number of generations. It's a way to kill them off without killing them. You kill them off by absorbing them. It's a form of genocide. So this is the argument. This is the argument. Of course there's more to it. A lot more to it. But this is the skeletal framework that you should use. Alright? This is the skeletal framework that you should use. And I want you to see that on this channel, we are building the presentable argument. The presentable argument. Because that is what I have been chosen to do. The ancestors have chosen me, and not just me, but I am one of the people who has been chosen to do exactly that thing. and I'm doing it. That's why I'm here. I have the utmost confidence that that's what I'm supposed to be doing, and that's why I'm doing it. Part of why I'm so confident about the fact that I'm supposed to be doing it is because I literally can't help myself. I obsess over the information, and have been for several years. Which brings us to today. It is what it is. Don't be afraid to get obsessive about the information. We need more people who are obsessive about the information. Please, please, please. I encourage you all, take notes, whether in your phone or in your computer or even on paper, if that's how you get down. Be a note taker so that all the information that is coming your way is not lost on you. Write down where to find all these nuggets that you get from myself and other content creators who share this information. You will turn yourself into an indomitable debater on the subject. Someone whom no one wants to deal with. So, I'm just saying, keep that in mind. Roll with this information because, in my opinion, these are the basics, and the basics are the most important. The basics are the parts that are gonna win the argument. All this other stuff, don't let it sidetrack you. This is what's going to win. This is what's going to win because it's going to win because it can be demonstrated. We want demonstrable evidence, and that's what this is. And it's from mainstream sources that the federal government acknowledges. I hope that this helps. Please, please, please start taking notes. Start taking notes. If you are privy to the fact that we're indigenous people, you must understand there is an awakening happening. There's a reason why you just think of it as a trend. It's not just a trend. There is a spiritual awakening happening amongst our people. Amongst our people. 7 great Algonquian sages prophesied that this would happen. And many of you may not believe in that sort of thing, but it's true. I plan on doing a presentation about that very soon. 7 great Algonquian sages, 7 Algonquian shamans prophesied that this awakening would come. It is the return to the sacred fire. And long before they prophesied it, they prophesied it within the last couple hundred years, but I mean, 10 times as long ago. The ancient Yatzaralim also prophesied it. They call it Kibbutz Galiot. Kibbutz Galiot. The ingathering of the exiles. We are they. We are the exiles. And we are being gathered back to the sacred fire. The sacred fire is the perpetually burning sacrifice. Alright? So I'm just telling you. I'm gonna present all of that. But that's all information we'll get to. But please take notes and join Unahia. I'm for real. Get in there, man. Get in there. Support Unahia, man. Just go to their page, support Unahia, get this, help them get this done, man. Help an organization that's trying to help you get recognized for being who you are. Because you understand the part of the advantage of this argument is the fact that you notice we didn't bring up no specific tribes at any point. We could talk about the Cherokee and all of that, but that's not the point. We don't need to bring up specific tribes. Even if you don't know what tribe you're from, even if you haven't done your genealogy, which is irresponsible when you out here talking about you an American Indian, but you ain't done no genealogy to prove it. But even if you haven't done any genealogy at all, it is mathematically impossible for you to not be indigenous to this land. So without even knowing what tribe you come from, what we should be able to say is, you're definitely indigenous. The question is, how African are you? You're indigenous to this land first. Then the question is, do you have any African in your DNA? Do you have any African blood? Right? That comes second. So I'm just pointing out, like, yo, this is how it is. That's just yet another advantage that this argument has. You can actually win with this without having any genealogical evidence of your specific bloodline being indigenous to this land. Consider it. Think about it. All right.